town hall, you are consenting to the recording as a part of the town hall. The content and presentation provided today is for informational purposes. It is not intended to be legal advice. With me today is our Deputy Secretary, Luis Barunda, and our Division Administrator, Michael Schlein, notary officers, and others from our staff. But first, allow me to introduce to you, please, Secretary Barunda. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Smith. We really appreciate you and Administrator Schlein's efforts in putting this informative presentation together. We're excited at the opportunity to continue to provide information that benefits our constituencies in various areas in the division that you administer. And I applaud the forward-thinking part of the way that this administration has continued to provide information to our constituents. And so, again, we're grateful for each. It looks like almost 300 people are on this particular webinar, and so we know that there's a lot of interest in this particular topic. So in any event, I'll let you get to the webinar and providing this valuable information. Thanks everybody for being on the call this morning.
Thanks so much, Mr. Secretary. Very grateful for you joining us. Please know the platform restricts attendance, not the Office of the Secretary of State, so anybody who's not able to get on, that's the reason. And in response to some emails that have been received, attendance is not required. The town hall is not the course of study or a substitute for the course of study, a requirement that was effective in the October 2021 law. Again, it's really our intent to reach out to our notaries public and all those who are interested. Time is reserved at the end for questions. You may find that your questions are answered as the presentation progresses, so you may want to hold your questions until that point. You may place any questions you have in the chat box, but please, in order to prevent any confusion about the source of the response, if you are participating in this town hall, do not respond to the questions in the chat box. Our staff or we will respond to them once we get to the question and answer session at the end. Our notary offices are available at the Office of the Secretary of State to answer your questions and to provide information only, but cannot provide legal advice. For legal advice, please contact the legal counsel who specializes in the area of law about which you have a question or concern. And we'll try to get to all the questions at the end of the town hall. And I think with that, I would invite you, if you have a microphone on, please turn it off, please mute it. You may keep your camera on if you like. We'd love to see your smiling faces. And at this time, allow me to introduce our phenomenal Division Administrator, Michael Schlein. Mike?
Thanks. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Smith. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary, as well, for your welcome this morning. So we're here today. We're going to talk about remote notarizations, and we're going to go over a lot of information today. And so our sources of legal authority for all this information, Maryland Constitution, Annotated Code of Maryland, Title 18 is where you're going to find all the notary law, and Code of Maryland regulations, 010208 is where all the notary regs are found, 1020801 through 12. So what we're discussing here, all that can be found in the law, in the regs, Constitution. So just first, some general housekeeping with remote notarizations and notaries in general, just requirements and qualifications. So remembering that in order to be a notary at all, you have to do or be certain things. You know, you have to apply and renew online, right? You have to have a photo ID that shows proof of that home address, verifies who you are, 18 years old, good moral character, integrity, be a resident of the state or have a place of employment or practice in this state. And so those are your general qualifications just to become a notary. And if you're renewing, you got to, you can renew within 60 days of your expiration, 60 days before or 30 days after your expiration. You'll see where all that ties in here in a little bit. as we talk about remote notarizations and getting authorized. And then effective October 1st, 2021, new notaries had to have completed a course of study and passed an exam, and renewal applicants had to have completed the course of study. So this is how you become a notary. Probably it shouldn't look unfamiliar to any of you that are on here today regarding remote notaries, but just refreshing that information. You have to be a notary before you can be a remote notary. So there is a notification requirement. Okay, so you've qualified as a notary, you've gone to the courthouse, received your commission, and taken your oath of office. So now you're officially a notary public. And so what do we need to do if we want to perform remote notarial acts? Well, the notary needs to notify the Secretary of State of their intention to perform the remote notarial acts, facilitated by communication technology, and that must be done prior to performing any remote notarial acts. The notary must use, if they're going to do a remote online notarization, they want to be an online notary, a remote online notary, and we'll talk about what that means in more detail here later on. They have to use the appropriate form and let us know what vendors they're going to use when they're going to do remote online notarizations. And the notary must submit the requisite notification to the Secretary of State's office and receive that authorization to perform remote notarial acts. So there's separate forms though now, remote notarizations for electronic records, and one for tangible record remote notarial acts as well. And that's remote notarial acts on tangible records. It's a relatively new thing as of June 1st of 2022. So we have one form for one and one form for the other. And so there's a few differences on the form, because for a remote notarial acts on electronic records, using a remote online notary vendor, you have to provide a vendor. But again, we'll cover the stuff in more detail a little later on. And nothing requires any person to accept, agree to, conduct, or complete a remote notarial act. A person that agrees to accept or conduct a remote notarial act doesn't have to agree to do it again in the future. They may refuse in any other transaction. So nothing requires somebody to get a remote notarial act. They can do a traditional notarization if they'd like. So a little information about the authorization process. Complete and sign and submit the appropriate remote notary notification form. And you're going to send it to that email address, remotenotary.sos@maryland.gov, remotenotary.sos@maryland.gov. Submit your remote notary notification form to that email address. And you're going to select, if you're doing remote notarizations for electronic records that require the remote online notary vendor, you're going to select one or more of the authorized vendors. That authorized remote online notary vendor list can be found on the notary page of our website. So if you've gone to sos.maryland.gov, and you clicked on the notary page, one of those links towards the top of the page is for the remote online notary vendors that are authorized for use in Maryland. You'd have to select one of those vendors if you're doing a remote online notary vendor form. And so we maintain that list and we update it whenever it changes. So if a new vendor is added or one's removed, then the list gets updated. So check that list when you're completing the form. And if the form is correct, Kathy, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, you're right. Thanks. I said, so in other words, folks, the notaries need to identify an approved vendor. They just can't select any vendor they want. They have to be approved by our office.
And so if the form is correct, completed, correct, you'll get a confirmation email from us authorizing you to perform remote notarial acts, whether that is remote notarial acts on tangible records or electronic records. Depending on the form you're sending and the information you're providing, you'll get the authorization from us that that is okay to be done now. And if something's not correct on the form, or it's incomplete, or if it's a remote online notary form for that require remote online notary vendor technology, if you're not selecting one of those vendors, or you select just a general video conferencing tool for that type of remote notarial act, then get an email from us saying this is not accepted, and letting you know why that is. So, and just because you're not accepted the first time doesn't mean you wouldn't be the second time. So if you submit something that's incomplete or incorrect, you can resubmit the remote notary notification form to correct any of those errors or complete the form, and then get authorized at that point in time once everything is in and correct. So it's not a one and done situation. If there's an error, you can fix it. So a notary must submit a new remote notary notification form to us upon each renewal of their commission. The reason is that your authorization to be a remote notary expires when your commission does, right? If you're no longer a notary, you cannot do remote notarizations either. So when your commission expires, so does your authorization to do remote notarial acts. So if you renew and you renew your commission, you go down to the courthouse, you get sworn in, you receive your commission for the next time around, the next 4 years, send us an updated remote notary notification form, and for authorization under this new commission, under this next commission. So notary authorized to perform notarial acts may cancel their authorization by submitting written notice to us. That can be in the form of an email if you'd like to that remotenotary.sos@maryland.gov, letting us know that you're no longer going to perform notarial acts and, to cancel your authorization. So that can be done. If you get authorized to be a remote notary, you do not have to stay a remote notary if you do not want to. So the Secretary of State may not authorize a notary to perform traditional or remote notarial acts if the person submits an application containing a substantial or material misstatement or omission of a fact. We talked on the prior slides about if your form is complete, we'll accept it and give you authorization as remote notary. If it's not, if it's missing something or there's a misstatement on it, then we would not authorize it. And this is true for not just remote notary forms, but your notary application or renewal application as well. If it's incomplete or contains an omission of a fact or material misstatement, it's not going to get approved. Notary cannot represent that they can perform remote notarial acts if they are not authorized to do so, in the same way that you cannot say you're a notary if you are not a notary. You can't perform remote notarial acts. You're not allowed to tell people that you can. Seems obvious, but worth pointing out, right? So there's a law that, a bill that passed and went into effect on June 1st. So it changed the law. And a few of the highlights of what happened here is it increased the maximum fees permitted by regulation for an original notarial act and a remote notarial act. It repealed an exception to remote notarizations that applied to wills and trust instruments. Previously, you could not perform a remote notarial act on a will or trust instrument. Now you can. Clarified when credential analysis and identity proofing are required. We're going to get into that a little later as we talk about remote notarizations for electronic records versus tangible records. Established requirements and procedures for remote notarial acts involving a tangible record. Specified procedures by which a notary public may administer an oath or affirmation to a remotely located individual, and authorizes the Secretary of State's office to adopt regulations prescribing methods for reasonable confirmation of a tangible record, and it clarified communication technology requirements applicable to remote notarizations. A lot of words summarized in brief by saying it allowed us to change notary fees by regulation, which we're going to show in a later slide, and also set up what we have now in the law, which is remote notarizations for tangible records and remote notarizations for electronic records. So we did increase the fee by regulation, and that went into effect on November the 14th. And the regulations allow for an original notarial act to charge up to $6. So your traditional regular notarial act, $6 now instead of $4. And a remote notarial act, you may now charge $25 per remote notarial act. So this does increase the price for remote notarial acts. Previously, it was $4 for a regular notarization, traditional one, and $4 for a remote notarial act. And so now it's $25 for a remote notarial act. So it clarified the definition of a remote online notary vendor And that's important because if you're doing remote notarizations on electronic records, you need that remote online notary vendor. And so it's just tweaked the definition to account for the changes in the law that took effect June 1st of 2022. And also, clarifying applications of the Notary Public when using communication technology applicable to remote notarizations. Again, really the difference between remote online electronic records and remote online tangible records, and clarify that a remote notary notification form must be submitted to perform remote notarial acts for tangible records, and that the notary must acknowledge their responsibilities in performing these actions. And as we talk about it a little more in detail later, you'll realize that a remote online notary vendor, their technology is set up to comply with the requirements of the law, whether that's recording it or electronic journal or credential analysis and identity proofing when required. All those things the remote online notary vendor technology does. But when you're doing a remote notarial act for a tangible record, and you may not have to use that remote online notary vendor technology, you're on your own to make sure that it's recorded, that you keep an entry in your register, et cetera, your journal. I mean, not your register, but your journal. So this form makes you sign off or acknowledge on a few things that you're going to be responsible for when you're doing remote notarial acts on a tangible record. So talking about the fees in a little more detail, and just in general, for regular notarial acts, you can charge $6 for each signature a notary notarizes on an original notarial act, $3 for each signature on each additional copy of the same record. $3 can be charged if you're asked to make copies of the document for each signature notarized. $3 may be charged for additional copies of the same document. $2 may be charged if you're requested a photocopy. And certifying a journal entry, $6. Mileage is still tied to the IRS rate for business travel, and a fee not to exceed $5. So again, $5 for travel, plus mileage, plus whatever it is you're charging for remote notarial acts. So these are all the tangible record fees. If it's a remote notarial act, again, $25 per remote notarial act.
And Mike, just to go back to what you said there for a second, when you said, and whatever you're charging for a remote notarial, because folks do not need to charge $25. They may charge up to, but not exceed 25, I think is what you meant there, right?
Correct. Yes, that's thanks for clarifying. That's exactly what I meant. These are maximum fees. You can charge less if you want. You don't have to charge at all if you don't want to.
Right.
But you can charge up to $6 for your traditional notarial act. You can charge up to $25 for a remote notarial act. Same with mileage, a fee not to exceed $5 for travel plus mileage can't exceed the IRS rate. So these are all maximums that are allowed to be charged, but a notary could charge less than what they're allowed to charge if they'd like. So just general powers and duties. So a notary public may perform these types of notarial acts: acknowledgments, oath affirmation, witness or attest, certified copy, certified copy of a tangible copy of an electronic record, protest. None of this changes for remote notarial acts. These are still your duties and your powers as a notary public, whether it's a traditional notarial act on pen and paper, with pen on paper, or a remote notarial act. These are still the types of notarial acts you're allowed to do, right? Whether you're doing it in person or using communication technology and doing it remotely, doesn't matter. This is what you do as a notary public. Identifying signers. This is going to look, some of this stuff is going to look very familiar, right? You still identify signers using government issued photo ID through personal knowledge. But you must always identify the signer. And we're going to get into a little detail about remote onlines for electronic records using remote online notary vendors. When you're identifying somebody through government issued photo ID, you also have to use something called credential analysis and identity proofing, which the remote online notary vendor technology has and includes for you. But you have to identify the signer, whether it's government issued photo ID, whether it's personal knowledge. Again, personal knowledge, do you know them or do you know them, right? through dealings sufficient to provide reasonable certainty that the individual has the identity claimed, and also the credible witness method by obtaining a verification on oath or affirmation of a credible witness who is personally appearing before the notary, and the notary can identify either through personal knowledge or on a basis of identification that can verify the identity of the signer of the record that the notary is going to notarize the signature of. So notary may require an individual to provide additional information or identification credentials to assure the notary of the identity of the individual. One of the nice things that, I mentioned credential analysis and identity proofing, remote online notary vendor technology. You identify somebody that you don't know using their ID, but they also have to pass through credential analysis and identity proofing so that you're absolutely certain that the person appearing on the other end of that audiovisual feed is the person that they claim to be. And so that remote online notary vendor technology is very, it can satisfy that requirement and is thorough or solid in making sure that they really are the person that they claim to be on video as maybe in person. Getting some feedback if you can mute yourself, please. So identifying minors, assessing competency and duress, all this, same thing, right? Whether you're in person or remote, identifying a minor, not always easy to do. They don't have a driver's license. Many of them don't have ID. So using a parent as a credible identifying witness in lieu of an ID. Competency and awareness, notary interacting directly with the person requesting the notarial act. This is true whether it's in person or remote. Should not perform a notarial act if the signer doesn't appear competent or aware of the documents that are to be notarized. Right? The notary's role, same thing, remote or in person. Observe and assess. It's you're not there to quiz the signer. You're not there to examine the document and decide whether or not you think it's good or sufficient, or you're observing and assessing, and you can do that just through basic day-to-day conversation, right? You get a pretty good idea of what's happening interacting with the signer. And again, whether that's in person or using audio-video technology for a notarial act. So if they appear to be impaired or lack competency to execute the document, the notary could make a determination of that and refuse to notarize. Same thing with duress. If the notary is not satisfied that the signature of the signer is knowingly and voluntarily being made, the notary may refuse that notarial act. And if the notary determines that a person is under duress or acting under duress, they should refuse that notarial act. Just like if you were in person and you assess that, same as remote. You can make that same assessment and make that denial if you need to. Authority of the notary. So the notary may perform notarial acts in any county of the state or in Baltimore City, right, regardless of where they're commissioned. The notary is not authorized to act in another state or in DC or any other territory. The notary must be physically present in the state of Maryland to act as a notary public. This is true even if you're acting as a remote notary. So if they're appearing before you using remote notary technology or it's a remote notarization for a tangible record, you, the notary, still have to be physically present in the state of Maryland to act as a notary public. So in person or online, still have to be present in Maryland. You're authorized using your Maryland Notary Commission to act in the state of Maryland, not anywhere else. So you have to be physically present in Maryland. I cannot stress that enough.
Mike, that's a really good point. Thanks so much, because I think there are folks who have thought that because they're remote notary, it didn't make a difference where they were located, but the notary actually does have to be physically located in the state of Maryland when performing even a remote notarial act. Thanks for making that point.
Yep, and a notary can notarize. It doesn't matter where the documents are coming from or where they're going to, right? As long as the notarial act, the notary is performing their duties in the state of Maryland. So in the in-person world, right, the traditional notarial act on pen and paper, where you're before me in my physical presence, right? The person has to be in Maryland because the notary has to be in Maryland, right? You have to go before the notary to notarize that, to get that document notarized, the notary has to be in Maryland. In the online world, the notary has to be in Maryland. The signer doesn't necessarily have to be, right? They're traveling online using that remote technology to the Maryland who's physically present to the Maryland notary who's physically present in Maryland. So a distinction there in the sense, the notary still has to be in Maryland when it's a remote online notarial act or remote notarial act using on a tangible record. As long as the notary's in Maryland, the notary's okay to act. Again, doesn't matter where the documents are coming from or going to. The notary has to be in Maryland when they act, whether that's in person or online. Same rules apply. Conflicts of interest, whether it's an on paper notarial act or electronic record, online, in person, whatever it is. Notary can't perform a notarial act for themselves or for their spouse, or if themselves or their spouse is a party, or if they or their spouse have a direct beneficial interest in the document that's being notarized. So the law prevents a notary from performing the remote notarial act or a regular notarial act in which the notary or their spouse has a direct beneficial interest. So again, you can't notarize your own signature, can't notarize your spouse's signature, can't do it if you or your spouse have a direct beneficial interest in the item that's being notarized. But beyond that, you really should refrain from notarizing for any immediate family member, even if you're not under the legal duty to refrain, right? You're under a legal duty to refrain from notarizing for yourself or your spouse, or in which yourself or spouse have a direct beneficial interest. But beyond that, maybe you stay away from notarizing for immediate family members. And everything's good until it's not, right? And it's although not under a legal duty to refrain for somebody other than yourself or your spouse, probably in your best interest to do that. And we've seen many of complaints come our way about notaries' actions involving notarial acts for family members, and everything was great when it was notarized. Something happened, and there's property or money or custody or what have you going on, and all of a sudden it's not okay anymore. So refrain for notarizing from any family member, whether it's in person or remote. And regarding any manner in which the notary is personally involved, even if indirectly or where there's no beneficial interest, if you're involved in the situation, you're named in the document, do yourself a favor and don't notarize it. Even if you're not under a legal duty to refrain, stay away, right? Again, everything's good until it isn't. And we see it all the time, and it's never a fun situation. There are a lot of notaries in the state of Maryland. You can find another notary to notarize for you, whether it's in person or remote. Same thoughts, same laws apply. A few other restrictions here that we're going to cover, just broadly. Notaries Commission doesn't authorize the notary to assist in drafting legal records or give legal advice. Again, practice law in person or remotely. Can't do it unless Now, if you're licensed as an attorney, you can give legal advice, right? But if you're just a notary public, the Notary Commission does not authorize you to draft legal records, give advice, or practice law. A Notary Commission does not authorize you to act as an immigration consultant or expert on immigration matters. It doesn't authorize you to represent a person in a judicial or administrative proceeding. It doesn't allow you to receive compensation for any of the above acts. So if you're a notary public and you're not something separately licensed that allows you to do any of those matters, can't use your notary commission to do it, right? Cannot use your notary commission to do those things, whether that's remote or in person. Still can engage in false or deceptive advertising in person or remotely. Can't use the term notario or notario public, unless the notary is a licensed attorney to practice law in the state. And you can't advertise that you may assist person in drafting legal records or give legal advice or otherwise practice law unless you're an attorney licensed to practice law in the state. All true whether remote or online. So now we're going to get into remote notarial acts in a little more detail here. So what is a remote notarial act? We've talked a lot about it, but what is it? What's its definition? It's an act performed by a notary using certain communication technology for a remotely located individual. Remote notarial acts are known also as remote online notarial acts, remote notarizations, remote online notarizations. You've already heard me use remote notarization and remote notarial act interchangeably. And so a remote notarial act, you're using communication technology for a remotely located individual. That's very different than your traditional notarial act where you have to be standing in front of each other face to face, right? We're in the same room at the same time. Together, I identify you, I watch you sign the document, then I sign the document. We're together in person, it's the same sheet of paper. Well, remote notarial acts allows that transaction to occur online and using certain technologies depending on the situation. So it allows you to be in a separate place from the signer while still satisfactorily identifying them and watch them sign, whether it's an online notarial act for a tangible record or for an electronic record. So effective October 1st, 2020, that's when the remote notarial acts became effective under the law. It allowed for remote notarial acts on electronic records. So remote notarizations using primarily technology primarily intended for video conferencing, they were not allowed as of October 1st, 2020. There was some temporarily allowed stuff under, in early mid 2020 under the COVID state of emergency. So when the law took effect, it made remote notarizations on electronic records the law, and that's what was allowed. Fast forward to June 1st, 2022, remote notarial acts on tangible records became legal in Maryland under the law, and this is where you can use video conferencing technology to perform remote notarial acts on tangible records. So electronic records has to be a remote online notary vendor. Tangible records doesn't have to be a remote online notary vendor that is used to conduct the remote notarial act. You can use a video conferencing tool for remote notarial acts on tangible records. We'll get into both of these here a little bit, and but important thing there to take away, October 1st, 2020, remote acts on electronic records. June 1st, 2022, remote acts on tangible records now also allowed, in addition to remote notarial acts on electronic records. And an electronic record stays an electronic record throughout the process of becoming notarized. A tangible record stays a tangible record throughout the process of becoming remotely notarized.
Mike, just before you begin on the next slide, let me just share a reminder with our participants in today's town hall that this recording will be posted online. And please, please, please do not respond to any of the questions in the chat box. Only our staff will be responding or presenting those questions to us. This is intentional so we can verify the authenticity of the response. A response from someone else who's participating is not a response that we can verify is an accurate response. So do yourselves a favor and refrain from responding to any questions and refrain from taking any response to a question that is not from our SOS staff or responded to during our Q&A session as valid. Thanks so much.
So remote notarial acts on an electronic record, again, effective October 1st, 2020, this was allowed under the law. The remote notarization in this situation, a signer appears before a notary at the time of notarization using audiovisual technology. Signer signs a document electronically. Notary notarizes the document electronically. The technology allows the notary to witness the signature being affixed by the signer while simultaneously affixing their notary seal. This is all occurring at the same time on the same recording at the same instance, but using this audio-visual technology rather than in person. Also known as remote online notarization. People have called it webcam notarizations, online or virtual notarization as well. So regardless of what you're calling it, though, the remote notarization requires the signing, witnessing, and notarization to occur during the same transaction. Validity of remote notarial acts. So remote notarial acts could not be performed for a will or trust instrument between October 1st of 2020 and May 31st of 2022. Effective June 1st of 2022, a will or trust instrument may be remotely notarized. Now all forms of documentation can be notarized. using the services of an authorized remote notary. Validity of remote notarial acts performed by a Maryland Notary Public authorized to perform remote notarial acts shall be determined under the laws of Maryland, regardless of the physical location of the remotely located individual at the time of the notarial act. So again, a lot of words. What's that mean? It means the notary has to be in Maryland when they're acting as a Maryland remote notary, and that remote notarial act is subject to Maryland laws when the Maryland notary is acting as a remote notary. So again, emphasizing here, bolded and in italics, so you know it's important, right? When performing a remote notarial act, a Maryland Notary Public is required to be physically located in Maryland. Obligations of a remote online notary vendor. So we talked about remote online notarial acts for electronic records. They're going to require the technology of a remote online notary vendor. And I'll call them RON vendors for short, is a company that provides communication technology primarily used to facilitate a notarial act for a remotely located individual. The technology offered includes identity proofing and credential analysis that the notary public may use when required by law to identify a remotely located individual. RON vendors are required to provide technology training to remote online notaries public. So if you are going to do remote notarial acts for electronic records, you're going to use a RON vendor's technology. When you sign up for that RON vendor's technology from one of our list of approved RON vendors that's on our website, they're going to teach you how to use their technology, right? You already know what a notary is supposed to do. You're a notary public. But you need to know how to use their technology to notarize remotely on their platform. And instruction prepares the notaries to use that RON vendor's technology and ensure compliance with the requirements of the law. And the technology offered by the RON vendor shall include a process for identity proofing and credential analysis as the law describes and requires when it requires it. So the RON vendor technology has the mechanism for identity proofing and credential analysis when you need to identify somebody using an identification credential. So RON vendor technology, lots of information. They're going to teach you how to use their technology. Today does not include a demonstration or anything like that. We're not going to teach you how to use remote online notary vendor technology. They're all there, but they're, like every different company or technology platform, there's some different bells and whistles and things for each technology that may process a little differently. So there's not a one-stop shop for using a RON vendor. The RON vendor is going to teach you how to use their technology. You're a notary, you know how to be a notary. You're going to learn how to use their technology to do it remotely. So identity proofing and credential analysis, you've heard me say it a few times. What is that? Well, identity proofing is a process or service where a third party provides a notary with means to verify the identity of a remotely located individual by reviewing personal information from public or private data sources. So you've heard, the knowledge-based questions. In other words, you got to answer 5 questions. And, it's only since these are questions that the signer would know and not necessarily anybody else. Credential analysis is a process or service where a third party confirms the validity of an identification credential by review of public or private data sources. So I flash my ID, I put it up on the screen, and the technology is able to verify the authenticity of that ID. Identity proofing and credential analysis is analyzing the credential, the identification credential, shall be performed by a reputable third party who provided evidence to the notary of the ability to satisfy the requirements of the law. Again, a lot of things here. I don't want you to get too hung up on, I got to do this. Well, if you're using a remote online notary vendor technology, it's being done as part of that process for you. Details of requirements for identity proofing and credential analysis are outlined in the law. So you want to know them. You want to know what they are. You want to know what's happening with the technology you're using. But the technology is going to do the identity proofing and credential analysis if you're using a remote online notary vendor technology. So the RON vendors technology provides this mechanism. And RON vendors are also discussed in more detail in the notary handbook. So if you have the handbook, you can check out part 12 of the Notary Handbook to learn a little more about RON vendors, their requirements, and what's going on there. So identification requirements for remote notarial acts on electronic records. Upon authorization to perform remote notarial acts on electronic records, a notary may perform a remote notarial act if the notary satisfactorily identified the signer, right? Did you verify, did you look at their ID? Did you verify they are who they are? Did they pass through? If you're looking at an ID, that's an identification credential, driver's license, passport, etc. Did they pass through credential analysis and identity proofing? So satisfactory identification, though, can still take place by personal knowledge. Right? You may know the identity of the signer. You may know for a fact that's them. They are who they say they are because you know them. You have personal knowledge of their identity. You could still verify identification through a credible witness and still through identification credential. But again, in the remote notary world, remote presentation of identification credential must also have credential analysis and identity proofing. So you can't just look at somebody's ID remotely and go, okay, that's it. They have to pass through. If you're identifying a signer remotely, they have to pass through credential analysis and identity proofing, which the remote online notary vendor platforms, their technologies do. Notary must reasonably confirm a record before the notary is the same record in which the remotely located individual made a statement or executed a signature. So you're looking at that record, you're watching that person on this remote technology sign that record, you're administering an oath or affirmation or acknowledgement on that record if required, and you're notarizing that record because you know, because you're looking at it as it's happening, you know it's the same record and you're going to notarize that. Audiovisual requirements of RON acts, remote online notarization acts. So the notary cannot know that making the statement or signing the record is prohibited by a foreign state in which the remotely located individual is located. There's a section of law that just says if the notary knows you can't do this in a foreign state or this isn't allowed in a foreign state, that they can't do it in that foreign state. Whether or not you know that may be an entirely different story. But if you do, if you know something's against the law, don't do it, right? Upon authorization to perform remote notarial acts, the notary or person acting on behalf and at the direction of the notary creates an audiovisual recording of the performance of the notarial act. So if you're using a RON vendor, the RON vendor technology, right, you're going to get trained on how to make sure this is being recorded. And the technology, the RON vendor technology is going to record that act and keep that recording for you. So that's when it says, the person or person acting on behalf and at the direction of, well, the RON technology is recording it for you and it's acting on your behalf and recording it for you. And again, you're going to get taught how to use that technology to ensure that the remote notarial acts are recorded. Remotely located individual located outside the United States. So the record must be filed with or relate to a matter subject to the jurisdiction of the United States or involve property located in territorial jurisdiction of the United States or involve transactions substantially connected with the United States. So if you're going to notarize for a remotely located individual, you're a Maryland notary, you're standing in the state of Maryland when you're doing a remote notarial act, and you're going to notarize for somebody that's not located in Maryland at all or not even in this country. And if you're going to do that for the remotely located individual that's not inside the United States, again, you're still in Maryland as a Maryland notary, but the remotely located individual could be anywhere. That remote notarial act must be a matter subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S., involve property located in a territorial jurisdiction of the U.S., or involve a transaction substantially connected with the U.S. So in order to do it for somebody outside the United States, it has to meet this criteria. Storage of audiovisual recordings. So an audiovisual recording created for a remote online notarization must be retained for a minimum of 10 years after the recording. So you have to keep that recording. And if you're using a remote online notary vendor technology, they might keep it for you, or they might have a mechanism for you to obtain it. But either way, that recording has to be kept for 10 years after the completion of that remote notarial act. The notary shall retain a journal and audiovisual recordings in the computer or electronic storage device that protects the journal and/or audiovisual recordings against unauthorized access by password or cryptographic process. The notary, guardian, conservator, or agent of the notary, or personal representative of a deceased notary shall retain the audiovisual recordings created or cause the audiovisual recordings to be retained by a repository. So the notary needs to keep this stuff. If the notary is no longer able to do it themselves, if somebody else has to be a guardian, conservator, or personal representative of the deceased, it's then their responsibility to retain the stuff for the 10-year minimum.
Mike, this might be a really good time to just remind notaries that it's actually in the notary's responsibility to keep these recordings. So if you work, and whether it's recording or whether it's the journal. So if you work for an employer for whom you are notarizing, you, the notary, are the one who's commissioned. You're the one who is responsible for maintaining these recordings, not the employer. And just make that point.
Yeah, a fantastic point to make. We get asked this question a lot about just your standard notarial acts, on paper with pen, in-person signings. Same is true of remote notarial acts. It's your recording. It's your journal. It's your notary seal that has your name on it. It's for things you did. You may not always be with that employer. And if you're not, and you go to a different employer, you need to take your stuff with you. They are your notarial acts under your name. Good point to make, and a good point to make that point. One other thing about audiovisual recordings, a notary can engage with a third-party repository. So if a notary by written contract engages with a third party to act as a repository for the required storage of electronic journal or recordings of remote online notarial acts, they can do that if they would like. And if there's a contract, it's deemed approved by the Secretary of State. We don't have a list of repositories or approved repositories, but if you have a written contract with a repository, then it is deemed approved because there's a written contract. As long as that contract enables the notary to comply with the retention requirements, even if that contract is terminated, or provides that information will be transferred to the notary if a contract is terminated. So if you enter into an agreement with somebody or a company to be a repository of your recordings or of your electronic journal records, then it has to include something that allows you to get it if you terminate that contract. So a little bit more about remote online notarial acts on electronic records. The certificate of the Notarial Act must indicate the Notarial Act was involving remotely located individuals and performed using communication technology. We have a whole town hall recording on the notary page of our website about types of notarial acts and notarial certificates and attaching them. And remote notarial act requires a certificate, but that certificate also has to indicate that the notarial act was performed for a remotely located individual and use communication technology. And the notary shall attach or logically associate their electronic signature and stamp to the electronic record, complying with these certain standards. Nothing shall require any person to accept, agree to, or conduct or complete a remote notarial act. We mentioned that earlier. A person that agrees to accept, agree to, or conduct or complete a remote notarial act may refuse to do so in the future. No one may require the notary to perform remote notarial acts with electronic records with the technology that the notary public hasn't selected. So, right, when you're a notary public, if you're going to do remote online notarial acts for electronic records that require a RON vendor, you're going to select one or more vendors that are authorized by us. Nobody can make you use a vendor that you haven't selected. So communication technology shall provide reasonable security measures to prevent unauthorized access to live transmissions of the audiovisual feeds, methods used to perform credential analysis and identity proofing, and electronic record that is subject of the Remote Notarial Act. So we talked a lot about remote notarial acts on electronic records, right, requiring a RON vendor. If you're identifying people in that form, you need to, using an identification credential, so an ID, you're using credential analysis and identity proofing. So now we're going to switch to remote notarial acts on tangible records. So this became allowed under the law on June 1st, 2022. It allows remotely located individuals signing a tangible or hard copy document using a wet ink signature. So this is remotely notarized, but on a paper record. Only allowed for individuals the notary can identify by personal knowledge or credible witness. So we talked a lot about identifying somebody using an identification credential, like a driver's license or passport or non-driver ID card, for remote notarial acts using on electronic records, because you have the credential analysis and identity proofing to help you identify somebody that you may not know. If you're doing a remote notarial act on a tangible record, you have to have personal knowledge of their identification or be able to use a credible witness to identify that person. And if the notary must identify an individual using an identification credential, the notary must use a RON vendor technology. So if you don't know the identification of the individual coming before you, or you can't use a credible witness to identify that person, you cannot perform a remote notarial act on a tangible record. Why? Well, you're not using a RON vendor's technology, so you don't have the ability to do identity proofing and credential analysis on somebody you're using an identification credential to identify. So this type of remote notarial act on a tangible record causes the tangible record to be signed and notarized. The record must be tangible throughout the entire notarization process. It does not get converted into an electronic record at all. Video conferencing technology or a RON vendor may be used to accomplish a remote notarial act on a tangible record. In this situation, the notary is responsible for recording the remote notarial act and maintaining the recording for 10 years. So many folks that are going to do a remote notarial act on a tangible record are just going to use a standard video conferencing technology. You can record it. You have to record it. But the technology usually allows you to hit the record button and record that process. But the key thing, what does a RON vendor allow? You got that recording stored on their technology, or the ability to have it stored by you for 10 years. The RON vendor's creating that recording usually, but if you're using just standard video conferencing technology, you have to create that recording. You have to maintain that recording. It is yours, and you still have to keep it for 10 years. So for a remote notarial act on a tangible record, there's a process that follows, and the individual appearing before the notary during an audiovisual recording signs the tangible record and a declaration. The required declarations in the handbook and the law. So if you need to look up the exact wording for the declaration, it's in our handbook. If you don't have the handbook, it's in the law. The law is linked on our website. You can search the entire notary law. It's linked from our website. So if the notary administers an oath, affirmation, or acknowledgement to the individual appearing before the notary must take the oath, affirmation, or acknowledgement as part of the required recording. So, notarial certificate that's attached to the document determines what type of notarial act the notary is performing. So if one of those is, if that certificate's an oath, affirmation, or acknowledgement, you're going to give the oath or affirmation or acknowledgement on the recording. And again, types of notarial acts. There's a whole town hall about that you can watch if you want to learn more about oaths, affirmations, and acknowledgements and the process for all those. But that process has to play out on the recording. The individual that signed the record and the declaration must send a tangible record and declaration to the notary no later than 3 days after the notarial act was performed. So it must be sent to them no later than 3 days. Sent in 3 days, not necessarily arrived to the notary in 3 days. But when we say sent, I referenced on a prior page that a tangible record stays a tangible record. Can't send this to them by email. Can't fax it to them, right? It's staying a tangible record throughout the entire process. After receipt of the tangible record and declaration, the notary must do the following things. They must reasonably confirm that the tangible record received is the same tangible record from the audio-visual recording, and execute the certificate required by law for remote notarial act on a tangible record. The required certificate is found in the handbook and in the law. So again, it must verify that, whether it's a witness or a test or acknowledgement or oath or affirmation, and the notary is going to complete that certificate to complete the notarial act. What is reasonably confirmed tangible record received? Must reasonably confirm the tangible record received is the same from the audiovisual recording. Get the paper record, take a look at your recording, right? That's a way to confirm that it is the same thing that you watch them sign that you're going to notarize. Yes, we've hit that point now where we're going to field some questions. Kathy, Assistant Secretary Smith, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm so grateful. What a great job you did today. I'm grateful for you. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us earlier. As I shared earlier and as indicated in the email notification about today's town hall, our town hall was recorded and the link will be available on the Secretary's website under the Notaries tab. And by choosing to join the town hall, as I shared earlier, you consented to the recording. And as stated previously, the content and presentation provided is for informational purposes only. It is not intended